Hello, I'm Susan Hall from Curtin University of Technology in Perth, Western Australia. I have with me today Professor Ortrun Zuber-Skerritt from the University of Southern Cross in Australia, and she's our visiting professor to help our academic staff at Curtin on the matter of qualitative research in the social sciences, and particularly looking at qualitative research in industry and collaborative research. Ortrun, it's a great pleasure to have you here at Curtin this week.
Thank you for inviting me.
Your sessions have been all most participative and well appreciated by our staff, particularly because Curtin has such an applied research focus, so that collaborative research and action research, which you've talked about, have great relevance to us. After today's session, Ortrun, one of the participants just asked me a very compelling question that I'd like you to add some more to, if you could. It was, as a postgraduate student, she said, I can sometimes feel I'm being railroaded by a supervisor. Or when I'm doing research in industry, I can feel the same thing happening by my management team or my sponsors, when they really want me to change my qualitative methodology to something that looks more positivistic. How could a student protect themselves against, or a researcher protect himself against that? Ortrun, do you think?
Well, I think that a researcher, whether a postgraduate student or a researcher in general, should have the right and make explicit not only their methodology, but the basic assumptions behind the methodology. And that is most important. In research, very often people concentrate on techniques and methods and take a superficial approach and concentrate on practices and improving practices, when it is most important, first of all, to look at the values and worldviews which guide those practices. That is why it's so important that researchers look at epistemology and their philosophical and theoretical framework, which is behind the research and guides them, before they then make their methodology clear. And methods are really secondary. Of primary consideration must be the philosophical and theoretical framework and assumptions behind the research.
So that if they have their epistemology straight, then they're far less vulnerable to being attacked on method.
And they can argue better.
Yes. And a lot of our students will say, I've never heard of the word epistemology, I'm afraid to say. How could a student get this? What can we do about that? How can we help?
I think students should get a reading list at the very beginning, and we should guide them to certain readings. For example, the classical books by Chalmers on what's this thing called science, or Rowan and Reason on human inquiry, or the latest book by Johan Mouton on understanding social inquiry, social research. And give them a reading list and let them read first, and then they can make a decision which paradigm, research paradigm, they feel most comfortable with.
Yes, yes. And so that's really a role for supervisors, isn't it?
Yes, we cannot impose research paradigm onto our students. They have to naturally grow into it.
Yes, yes. And I don't think that that's always the way that it happens, because I suppose as supervisors we tend to supervise from our own paradigm, our own epistemological framework, and we might perhaps be advised to stand back one and let the student go forth and explore first, and then make the decision as to who supervises. I suppose that can mean changing supervisors quite early in the piece.
Yes, yes. And that is a better way of operating. It is better to change supervisors and, or first of all, to know who is who in the faculty and what approach do they take. But for students it is important to learn where they stand, what position they take, what theoretical position they are most comfortable with, and then select the supervisor.
Yes.
And each supervisor has to be clear about his or her theoretical framework.
Yes.
For example, I always make my theoretical framework of action research clear to my postgraduates so that they know where I come from. And I have this very simple diagram where I say that to me action research is not just a technique, but a philosophy, a methodology, and a theory of learning. And my philosophy is based on the three main pillars of action science or action theory, based on Leontief's work, critical theory based on the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and Kelly's personal construct theory. The methodology I use is mainly case study methodology, also in illuminative evaluation, phenomenology, and phenomenography. Techniques I use are repertoire grid technique based on the personal construct theory, nominal group technique, reflection, diary or journal, and a theory of learning, action learning, adult learning in general, and experiential learning.
And you laid that all out to the student at the beginning.
Yes, and then they are very interested in theories of learning, and I explain these to them. For example, when we talk about experiential learning, is opposed to traditional learning, where the teacher instructs the students as if the student had no prior knowledge.
Yes.
In experiential learning, we assume that adults can create knowledge on the basis of their concrete experience by observing and reflecting on that experience, by formulating abstract concepts and generalizations, and then testing the implications of these concepts in new situations which give us new concrete experience. And it is an ongoing, lifelong cycle of learning and of creating knowledge.
Yes. And this looks like Kolb, does it?
Yes, that is the Kolb learning cycle.
What is it called? Learning cycle, is it?
Yes.
And it's also implicit in the cycles of action research, isn't it?
Yes.
And so this again you share with your student
Yes.
at the beginning. I think that's a good idea.
And normally people who are interested in action research share these assumptions.
Yes. And talking of action research and collaborative research, as we are today, for a university who has an applied research focus and a great interest in increasing research with industry, I was interested in what you were saying in today's presentation about combining an action research project with an industry-based research project, or even with a PhD thesis.
Yes.
I thought that's very applicable to the situation at Curtin. I can think of lots of situations, fields of and disciplines that we could apply that model in. So can you tell us a bit more about that here?
Yes, there we have to distinguish between the field work, which can be collaborative, and the students' study or project, which leads to a master or PhD or whatever. And that has to be independent. It has to be the student's work in the end. But the field work can be collaborative. And Chet Perry and I have demonstrated this simply in this diagram, where we say that an action research thesis can be designed like an action research project, where in the first cycle you plan the thesis,
Yes.
and that includes the problem definition and analysis and the literature review. Then you act, you do the field work collaboratively, you evaluate the results and the whole process of the field work as an independent scholar, and you draw your own conclusions from this field work when you write the first draft. Now, you might have, or you will have gone through the same cycle before, collaboratively with your co-researchers in industry, in an organization, where you also plan the project, you implement it, you act, you evaluate, observe it, and you reflect on the results. This will then lead probably to the necessity to revise the plan and to go into a second cycle of action research. And again, you implement this new revised plan, you observe and evaluate, monitor, reflect on the results, and so on. And you might go through several cycles of action research collaboratively in the organization. But as I said before, you then, as a PhD student, for example, you take a more distant stance and evaluate this whole field work in the light of the literature.
Yes, so this is the stepping in and the stepping out, epoche.
Yes.
That lovely word epoche, isn't it? The researcher has to engage in.
And then you go on after your first draft, you plan the final draft, you write the final draft and evaluate it by seeking comments, revising it, proofreading it, and so on. And you come to the final conclusion of the thesis, and you direct your readers or examiners to further research, because it is impossible to come to an end of the this is ongoing, and you will lead other researchers to the gaps which you were not able to fill completely.
So really these, as a thesis or an independent research, these kinds of studies would be exploratory studies by nature, would they?
Yes, you will never know the answer when you start.
Yes.
The research question or problem is always very complex.
Yes.
And
very open.
Very open, and you will be open all the time and take on board issues as they arise.
Today, someone raised the matter of using that model within a DEAT-funded project such as our SPURT grants, which we currently have available. And have you got any further tips to give us about that prospect?
Yes, we have used this in several projects, postgraduate projects. For example, Ron Passfield, my PhD student, has used this model, and many others have used this model for projects on organizational development and change. And they found that not only have they achieved their aim of changing the organization, but also it is a very good way of professional development, management development. The people involved in the collaborative research will be changed themselves, or a new word creation is to recreate the leaders as well as the organizations.
Yes, yes. And so in applying for, using this model to make a grant application, what would you advise? Being as it's not a positivistic model, therefore it doesn't meet readily with the usual criteria for selection.
You can point out that the fieldwork is research, but the main purpose is development. That is the consultancy part in the project.
Yes, yes.
And if you write an application for SPURT, you will probably have to write it in their language and follow their guidelines and point out that this leads to research. The end result is not only practical improvement and change in an organization, it also leads to rigorous systematic research.
Yes, so in fact I suppose in traditional research terms we would call that phase which you've got labelled as core action research project, we might call that our fieldwork phase, our investigatory phase. Well, you do, don't you? You call it your fieldwork phase. Yes, that's it. It's simply the fieldwork. Collection of data.
Yes.
Yes, well, I think that's got some great prospects for us, and I hope we can
And it can be adapted to suit particular needs.
And leading towards a conclusion here, Ortrun, if I can do so on a slightly personal note, which I hope won't embarrass you, somebody at the session today and at an earlier session this week said of you something which I think has great relevance for us as teachers and as academics, and that was that they noted you as a very humble person, a humble scholar, humble and knowledgeable. What do you say about this humbleness? What does this mean to you?
It means to realize that there is a whole ocean out of there of knowledge which we don't know. We can only grasp a little bit of knowledge. Reg Revens, the father of action learning, is a very humble man, and in one of the video recordings we did at the first Congress on action learning and action research, he said in this video that he worked with I think 10 Nobel Prize winners in one department in the University of Manchester, and one condition for working or for presenting something at a seminar was that they had to say what they didn't know. They shared their ignorance.
So the Nobel Prize winners were asked to share their ignorance.
That's right. They did not boast.
They say researchers must have a sense of irony, don't they?
So I think, yes, in research that applies too, that we can only attempt to take little steps further to advance knowledge, practical and theoretical knowledge. But there is a lot more out there, and to realize that makes you humble.
Yes, indeed. I couldn't disagree. Ortrun, thank you very much for this session today, and
It was a pleasure.
I hope these thoughts of yours are going to be of use to those who watch. Thank you.